Before the 7th of October, Israel was employing what I called in some of my articles a policy of incremental genocide in the Gaza Strip. You can kill people in more than one way. You can avoid the growth of a new generation, or you can traumatize a whole new generation without killing them. You can make sure that babies don't have the right infrastructure to live. It doesn't all have to be in massive killing by bombarding from the air. So, yes, first and foremost, pushing people to the south, which already happened. 1.1 million have already been pushed to the south. It's already an ethnic cleansing. But within the context of which Israel uses its military force against the civilians, hospital, mosques, schools, community centers, even bombing the area that it claims, like Zahara, that it claims is part of the security, is a secure space, is more than just ethnic cleansing. It's ethnic cleansing with incremental genocide.
تحياتي للجميع في كمان حلقة من بودكاست الميدان. أنا عابد أبو شحادة عبر موقع عرب 48. بس زي دائما قبل ما نبلش ما تنسوش تتابعونا عبر جميع تطبيقات البودكاست، سبوتيفاي، أبل، جوجل، أنغامي، بتلاقونا هناك. إحنا مكملين بسلسلة الحلقات بالإنجليزي، تغطية الأحداث كمان في الداخل وكمان في فلسطين التاريخية. واليوم رح تكون معي حلقة مع بروفيسور إيلان بابي. As I mentioned in Arabic, this is another episode in English covering the war, and today I am honored to have Professor Ilan Pappe. On a personal level, your book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, I read it when I was 18, and it meant a lot.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you. Very happy to be with you here once again.
Thank you for your time. For those who don't know, Professor Ilan Pappe is the director of the European Center of the Palestinian Study at the University of Exiled. Published more than 20 books. We can say also hundreds of papers.
Yes.
And the most significant one, I think we would all agree, which also shifted something in the academia in general, as a historian, was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, I want us to record an episode over recent events, the war in Gaza, but I want us to do this through the lens of your book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Okay.
And since the events of the October 7th and the beginning of the war in Gaza, we have seen more and more Israeli politicians, journalists, publicists, and other public figures use loaded or controversial terminology, from classifying Hamas as ISIS and Nazis to describing them as human animals. But what stood out was the use of the word Nakba and cleansing. In Hebrew, letahir Gaza, to cleanse Gaza. And from a historian point of view, and someone who studied the Palestinian Nakba, what do you see is happening, especially from the events of October 7th in Gaza?
Yes, I think it's, people talk about the events in Gaza as a new Nakba. I think it is another chapter in the ongoing Nakba, or as they say in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra. And this goes back first and foremost to the nature of the Zionist movement and the kind of state it created in 1948. I think most of the researchers now rightly refer to the Zionist movement as a settler colonial movement. And settler colonial movements are motivated by what the late great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, called the logic of the elimination of the native. Elimination doesn't always mean genocide. It could be also ethnic cleansing. It could be also siege and enclaving. But what is important, that the basic motive and objective of any settler colonial movement is to take as much of the natives' land without the natives themselves. Now, this was the objective of the Zionist movement from its very inception. And since its inception, it was always looking for historical opportunities and pretexts to implement this vision of a de-Arabized Palestine, or at least to de-Arabize as much of Palestine as possible. Now, it's obvious that until 1948, the Zionist movement did not have the means, did not have the capacity to massively ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Palestine. But once the opportunity occurred and the decision of Britain to leave Palestine opened such an opportunity, we know what happened. And this was the ethnic cleansing of 1948, when half of the Palestinian population was expelled, half of their villages destroyed, most of their towns were demolished, but it was an incomplete ethnic cleansing. Now, it was also incomplete in the sense of a takeover of historical Palestine. Israel only took over 78% of historical Palestine. And the territorial appetite for taking more was always there. So then came the next opportunity, which was 1967, in which Israel was able to take over the whole of historical Palestine. But with the whole of historical Palestine came more Palestinians. By the way, in brackets, this is why the great architect of the ethnic cleansing of 1948, David Ben-Gurion, objected to the occupation of the West Bank. He said, I orchestrated the expulsion of almost 1 million Palestinians, and now you are incorporating the same people that I actually expelled. Most of them were, refugees in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In any case, he was out of politics in 1963, so he's not relevant anymore. After 1967, Israel did not have the same opportunity as 1948 for massive ethnic cleansing or expulsion. Again, to have the whole territory with as few Palestinians as possible. So it resorted to other means. For example, it started to close Palestinian areas in order not to calculate them demographically. The worst kind of translation of this idea came in Oslo, unfortunately, that everybody bought as a peace process, but it was not a peace process. This was exactly the demographic solution Israel thought would work. Namely, you have Palestinian areas, A and B, which Israel doesn't have to consider demographically because they are not voting and are not electing. And the rest, Israel controls directly. So it can somehow manage this balance between taking the whole of Palestine and incorporating more Palestinians. It became even more convenient in 1994 when they started to separate the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. And in 2006, and that's where people never understood why Ariel Sharon and the government after him, Ehud Olmert, were so keen on withdrawing the Jewish settlers from the Gaza Strip. Well, it was, again, in order to create another, if you want, mega prison, like Area A, another Area A, but this one, the Gaza Strip, and therefore you don't need to calculate the people of Gaza in the overall demographic balance. What they didn't take into account, of course, was the rise of the Hamas, Kamukawama also as a resistance. This they didn't know would happen. Otherwise, I don't know what they would have done. But definitely, they didn't expect the Hamas to be so powerful and so on. So I'm just coming to our days. Many people in the West describe the Israeli reaction to what happened on the 7th of October as a campaign of revenge. I don't think it is a campaign of revenge. I think it's another moment where the Israeli policymakers think that they have an opportunity to do something in time of war that they cannot do in time of no war. I don't call it peace because there's never peace. But there's no war and war. We are now in a time of war. They remember in 1948, when you are supposedly or allegedly in a time of war, ethnic cleansing is more acceptable to the world. In this, the very cynical one here compared to 48 is that they say that they like the people to leave in order to get them into a safe haven. But this is not the idea. The idea is really to try and solve the issue of Gaza by depopulating it. And don't forget that you still have the messianic settler elements in this Israeli government who are dreaming of bringing back the Jewish settlers into the Gaza Strip, or at least into parts of the Gaza Strip. So I think what we have here is nothing new, not in the terms of the desire to continue the ethnic cleansing of 1948, and not in the way that Israel uses a war as a pretext to implement in a more drastic and dramatic way its wish to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible.
So just to put things into perspective, a couple of weeks ago, news agency Sikha Mekomit and 972 magazine have published an official paper by the Ministry of Intelligence describing what are the options as a policy for Gaza. And the third option was stated clearly to push the population from Gaza to Sinai. This on the one hand. On the other hand, you mentioned the settlers in the West Bank. In recent weeks, since the beginning of the war, they've been starting to give out flyers to Palestinians, threatening them of a second Nakba and pushing them to Jordan. How serious do you think this is in the current escalation? And do you think this is a new opportunity for policymakers to draw new geopolitical lines in this region?
I think first of all, I think it's very serious. I think, let's start with the plan for Gaza. By the way, it's not the first time that Israel had these ideas. I wrote a book called The Biggest Prison on Earth, which was based on declassified Israeli documentation from 1967, the government cabinet meetings of 1967. That cabinet seriously discussed the possibility of expelling the people of Gaza into two directions, into Egypt and into the West Bank, and by that getting rid of the population in Gaza, but the war was too short, so to speak. There was only 6 days in the June 67 war, and they understood that after the war it would be much more difficult to implement such a massive expulsion. I would take it very seriously. I don't think it's the only scenario that might unfold, because it does not only depend on the Israelis. I mean, there are many unknown factors. One of them is the resistance is not over in the Gaza Strip. And I know there is a lot of what the Israeli like to call the fog of war. So they don't tell the Israeli viewers and listeners exactly what's happening in the Strip. But it's not going to be an easy occupation. It's not, and we don't know exactly when would the Israelis feel that they have to stop because of casualties and so on. So I would be less sure that this is exactly how the war would end, and then Israel would have a free hand to decide whether it expels the people to Egypt or not. Secondly, I don't think the Egyptians would ever allow it. So what would happen? I mean, Egypt would not allow, unless Abdel Fattah Sisi would receive such a reward from America for this. But I'm not, I'm really, I can see a very messy attempt to implement it rather than a very structural, because you need cooperation from others. Israel cannot totally do it unilaterally if it wants to do it on the Egyptian soil, right? But I would take it seriously. I mean, I would take it seriously as an Israeli objective, one possible objective. As worrying is Area C, not the whole West Bank, but Area C. Area C, just to remind our listeners and viewers, Oslo divided the West Bank into Area A under direct control of the Palestinian Authority, Area B under a joint Israeli and PA control, and Area C is Palestinians who live actually under Israeli control with no Palestinian Authority presence. And Area C is big. It's almost 60% of the West Bank. I can see if the political composition in Israel is not going to change dramatically in terms of ideology, not in terms of personalities, but in terms of ideology, if it's not going to change dramatically after the events in Gaza, that there will be a push to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Area C. By the way, not necessarily into Jordan, but to push them into areas B and A. I would take very seriously these plans. I would always remind ourselves that they are easier to be implemented under the pretext of a war. That is why the Israelis are very worried if there will be a change in the international community approach to a ceasefire. I mean, it's unacceptable. I don't know. I don't have enough words either in English or Hebrew or Arabic to describe my outrage of the fact that Britain, France, Germany, and the United States refuse to join an international effort to ask for a ceasefire. It's very clear that the Israelis don't want the ceasefire, not only in order to defeat the Hamas, but in order to be able to create new facts on the ground. And I'm sure the policymakers in the West know it. And then they would say, oh, we didn't know it happened and it's too late, which is always the story of historical Palestine. So yes, just to sum up, I would take it seriously. I'm not a fatalist. I'm not a determinist person. I think there's a lot all of us can do to try and stop it, but we definitely should take it seriously as an Israeli objective, both for Gaza and for Area C of the West Bank.
I just want to add a few numbers to what you just elaborated on. Since the beginning of the war, about 90 Palestinians were shot to death in the West Bank.
I think it's much more, but now it's more than 100 by now.
And these are numbers much higher than the fatal month of the Second Intifada.
Exactly.
About 1,500 Palestinians have been arrested in the West Bank. And today we're recording on Wednesday. On Monday and Tuesday, Israel has dropped about 6 tons of explosives on Jabalia refugee camp north of Gaza.
Exactly.
But today it's 2023. Egypt of today and Jordan of today are not the Egypt and Jordan of 1967, nor are they the Egypt and Jordan of 1948. Egypt has mobilized its forces also to Sinai and threatened that moving Palestinians into the West Bank, for them, it's a national security threat. From how you read history, the idea of pushing Palestinians into Sinai and not allowing them to come back to their house, is this, in the year 2023, is this a possible outcome of the war?
It is one possible. I'll tell you what is more likely, and I'm afraid to say it because it's horrible to think about it. Because of the Egyptian position, probably a more likely scenario is the division of the Gaza Strip to north and south. In the north, what I would call the North Gaza Strip includes the city of Gaza, I should say. We have Wadi Gaza. It divides the strip into south and north. What the Israelis will try as plan B, if Egypt is not going along with their plan A, is at least to have the refugees, the new refugees from Gaza, in the south, which is a horrific scenario because there's even less space than in the whole of the Gaza Strip, and the Gaza Strip is one of the most dense populated area in the world, hoping that the Egyptians, maybe not massively, but would allow people to move to the Egyptian side of Rafah, to the Egyptian side of El Arish, not an official Palestinian enclave inside Egypt, but something that is partly in Gaza, partly on the border, and maybe a little bit into Egypt, and they would use the Americans and whoever they can to make it worthwhile for Sisi. Anyway, it would not be an official. To my mind, it would not be. So Abdel Fattah Sisi would not have to say, we agreed to create a refugee camp in Sinai. He would say, no, we didn't, but we know how the Middle East works. In reality, this is a possibility. It's not the only one. By the way, again, I'm saying it's not the only one, but to say that it's impossible, I wouldn't say.
Both options, whether it's in Sinai or pushing Palestinians in Gaza to the southern parts of Gaza, would it be classified as ethnic cleansing?
Even more so. It would, and I think, maybe I'll preface it with one sentence that I keep saying in my interviews since this whole event began. As terrible as this event is, it's not a game changer. It's not a game changer. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later about the liberal Zionists who hoped it would be a game changer, make it easier for them to be Zionists. But we'll put it aside. It's not a game changer. As horrific and terrible as it is, it's not a game changer. What do I mean by this? Before the 7th of October, Israel was employing what I called in some of my articles a policy of incremental genocide in the Gaza Strip. You can kill people in more than one way. You can avoid the growth of a new generation, or you can traumatize a whole new generation without killing them. You can make sure that babies don't have the right infrastructure to live. It doesn't all have to be in massive killing by bombarding from the air. So, yes, first and foremost, pushing people to the south, which already happened. 1.1 million have already been pushed to the south, is already an ethnic cleansing. But within the context of which Israel uses its military force against the civilians, hospital, mosques, schools, community centers, even bombing the area that it claims, like Zahara, that it claims is part of the security, is a secure space, is more than just ethnic cleansing. It's ethnic cleansing with incremental genocide that goes on. I don't know, I'm sure you know the situation in the hospitals. And if you think, for example, on the babies who are in incubators, that Israel says, oh, you can take them to the south. You cannot take babies in incubators to the south. You cannot. You have to keep treating them in the hospitals. You cannot move people who are badly wounded to the south. So the Israelis treat it as a collateral damage. Okay, those who cannot move will be killed by our bombardments. This is all dehumanization that I think international law very clearly would define, as I say, not just as ethnic cleansing, but also as genocide.
In your book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, when you go through what we know today as Plan D, Tukhneet Dalid, and the ethnic cleansing of 500 Palestinian villages, you mentioned something very important, that even though there weren't clear commands telling the troops what to do, the Israeli militias at that time, they knew what they had to do. Now, when we listen to journalists and news agency and so on, clearly there's a sense of revenge on a personal level. How much of it do you think their action in Gaza comes from a direct order from the military leaders or the politicians, and how much is it comes from individual sense of revenge against Palestinians because of what happened on October 7th?
Yeah. First of all, I would say that the biggest crimes against humanity in history were never perpetrated by a master document. I mean, you will never find the order for genocide in all, and we had, unfortunately, as human beings, we witness in modern times quite a few genocides. You never find a document. What you find is an atmosphere, an environment, and tactical orders that only if, as an historian, you look at them from above and you connect the dots, you see that the tactics actually translate into a strategy that is fed by an ideology. And I think that's what we have here now. The soldiers are getting very clear orders or commands to disregard the civilian population in the very section that they are operating. Now, they don't know exactly what's happening elsewhere. So they don't know or don't care, and they wouldn't even know if they cared, that they are part of a larger project of ethnic cleansing and genocide. But the people who sit in what the Israelis call the pit, the bor, this is the high command in a cellar in Tel Aviv, in the center of Tel Aviv.
A war cabinet.
A war cabinet, exactly. They know exactly what they are doing, and they know exactly how to they're trying to cover up, not because of their own moral inhibitions, because they're afraid that there will be an international reaction. A very horrific example for what I'm saying here, that there is a plan, but the plan will never be written in a document, is the way the Israelis are preparing world public opinion to the bombing of hospitals. They started by saying that underneath Al-Shifa hospital, there is the high command of the Hamas. They are now moving to say that actually all the other hospitals and the UNRWA schools and so on. This is very worrying because they are saying it as justification not to what they have done, but what they are going to do. And this is again our wish to call the world as terrible as the crimes that have been committed were until now. It is only the beginning, and it will be worse. It will be far worse. And I come back to my early point. I can really not understand how. I understand, but I still find it difficult to accept how policymakers, especially a democratic president in America, is standing by when they have all the information. Not only, the Americans know not only what Israel has done so far, I'm sure they know what Israel plans. Now, it is true they're trying to limit some of the Israeli actions. That's what we learned from Washington Post, New York Times. I think they are reliable journalists. I believe them when they say that America has looked at the Israeli. This is really worrying, by the way, because I said the Americans have looked at the Israeli plans for the next stages, and they asked them to change them, to revise them, to make them more limited. I don't think the Israelis are going to listen to them. But the Americans would say, okay, but we advise them. It's the Americans don't condition their support for Israel in return for such a revision. They hope it would kind of carry the message to the Israelis, maybe you can be a little bit less brutal in the way that you are creating this human disaster in Gaza. But I don't think the Israelis are going to listen to them, and I don't think the Americans, at least now, are going to stop them. I just came from the United States. I must tell you that I don't know how people understand it here, but the American public opinion is appalled by the American position. I've never seen such a support for the Palestinian case. I think what really surprises the Israelis, they thought that because, and these were horrific scenes, I have to admit, that came from the kibbutzim and the settlement, the Israelis were sure that the public opinion, I'm not talking about the politicians in Congress and so on, but that the public opinion would totally shift in support of Israel. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. People are not stupid. They're not losing the context of why things happened. And Americans know their own history. They know that people like African slaves, like Native Americans, sometimes when they reacted in a very cruel way, but it never invalidated the moral right of the African slaves to rebel or the Native Americans to try and resist the genocide of their people.
As a historian, I want to hear your thoughts on the terminology that is being used by the Israelis describing Hamas as ISIS or ISIL or Nazis. How do you see it? How do you understand it? And is it really effective, or is it only effective for Israelis themselves?
First of all, I want to say there's nothing new about the Nazification of the Palestinians. I'll come back to ISIS in a moment. If you remember, Menachem Begin described Yasser Arafat in the bunker in Beirut as Hitler in the bunker. There are few good works by actually critical Israeli historians who show how Israel Nazified the Palestinians, namely describe Palestinian action as a continuation of the Nazi attempt to destroy the Jewish people. The reason that it was done in the past and it's done now, when you Nazify someone, is to justify anything you're going to do to them. Mm-hmm. It gives you license to do the kind of thing that Israel is doing. The comparison to ISIS is directed not so much to the Israeli public, it's directed more to Europe in order to, again, decontextualize the Palestinian action. Instead of having an analysis They're worried if there will be an analysis like the one that was suggested by the Secretary General of the United Nations. They would say, yes, we condemn what the Hamas did in the kibbutzim and the settlement or in the development towns, but don't forget, as he said, we don't forget the context of 56 years of occupation, right? They don't want this kind of analysis. They don't want this kind of narrative to dominate the conversation in the West. So ISIS, in the eyes of the West, has no context. It is just a fanatic, cruel, inhuman ideology that blindly killed everyone, including Muslims. If this is such a false comparison, such a decontextualized, dehistoricized comparison, but it's meant, again, as I say, I think the Nazification is meant more for the domestic Israeli public, and the ISIS is meant for the outside. Towards the outside, it will not work. It may work a little bit, but in the long term, it will not work.
People are not stupid.
People are not stupid, especially in 2023. There are so many sources of information, so many ways of gathering information and knowledge that I don't think it will work. The Israeli public is not critical public. I'm talking about the Israeli Jewish public. It's not critical. They accept everything that the media tells them. They lost their, it's very sad to me as a Jew to say that they lost the critical faculties that Jews were very famous for. They're just like a herd following the Israeli leadership. I have also a personal issue here. As someone who lost his most members of his family in the Holocaust, they abused, and they've done it before, but it's just another example how Israel abuses the Holocaust memory in order to justify very cruel actions against the Palestinians.
I want us to talk a bit about the Israeli society in these days. And for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the past month was extremely difficult because we're not only seeing institutional violence that unfortunately we got accustomed to, we're seeing also a new behavior coming from the Israeli society themselves. How do you understand the Israeli society and their behavior towards the war in general, and especially the Palestinian citizens of Israel?
Yeah. Towards the war, I think that the Israeli society, most of it, not all of it, thank God, but most of it, is totally following the media, especially the televised media. That televised media is mainly based on this new image of not only the Hamas, but the Palestinians as a whole, as Nazis, as enemies that you cannot negotiate with, you cannot talk with. It's almost like the message that you get from the Israeli Jewish society is that what happened on the 7th of October absolves us from anything bad we've done in the past and gives us a green light to do whatever we want in the present. Again, I'm generalizing. I know, and I'm very happy that it's not all the Israeli Jewish society, even among relatives who lost people on the 7th of October or still have members of family who are in Gaza. Not all of them are willing, as one of them said, that Israel would talk in their name in such a manner or develop such an attitude. Now, the worrying one side aspect is the one you mentioned, is again, it's a pretext to treat the 48 Arabs, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, in a way they always wanted to, but were inhibited by their wish to still be regarded as the only democracy in the Middle East, by the connection between human rights organizations in Israel, such as Adalah, to human rights organizations or ministries of foreign affairs in the West. They believe, for example, I can give one example, they were really, both the important members of the Israeli Jewish society and important members of the Israeli media were very happy to hear that the Swiss government decided to suspend funding to NGOs like Adallah, and not only Adallah, I'm just mentioning Adallah because it's important. And that, I'm not sure that the Swiss understand what they did. The message was there is now a Palestinian society with no protection. They have no legal protection. They have no police protection. And we can add our own input to changing also Israel from within. This is a very worrying time for the Palestinian citizens in Israel. It's not that the Jewish racism towards them was not there before. As I say, this is not a game changer in that respect. It's just as long as the war continues, I'm afraid to say that I expect more of what you describe to happen. Again, the war will not be forever. And when the war will end, I think some of these horrific attitudes from below by the society or the policies from above will be reverted. I think so. I don't think it will. I don't think it's a long-term phenomenon, but it just shows you that what I claimed and many other historians claimed, every war that Israel is staging, and most of the Israeli wars, in fact, all of them, were wars that Israel started, contrary to the Israeli propaganda that they always had no choice wars. They started all the wars, from 48 to 60, 56, 67. Maybe 73 is the only one that they really did not start. But they started 82 for sure, and now this war. All these wars are means and pretext to fulfill what we started our conversation with. This insoluble issue for a movement which ironically doesn't only want to make Palestine Jewish, it wants to make Palestine a democratic Jewish state. But it's not Jewish and it's not democratic because of the Palestinian presence in it. And they have no plan B for that.
But this makes what your claim over ethnic cleansing so important for the Zionist project. In order to be Jewish and in order to be democratic at the same time, you have to ethnically cleanse Palestinians so they won't be an equal player in a democratic state. In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you're not only an academic observer, you're also an activist. And being an activist, you have to be optimistic over the future, and you're also claiming to be an agent of change. What would you think would happen the day after the war ends? And do you think, is there, like from a historical perspective and from events that happen throughout history, do you think after these events, traumatic as they are, people tend to change their behaviors and try to think of or imagine new realities to what they did and what they went through in the past, during the war and the past decades?
I think I would divide my answer to short-term and long-term. In the short term, I think some of the important processes that took place before the 7th of October and froze because of the war would be reignited. I'll give you an example for what I think is the most important process. And that helps me to try and envision what would happen after the war. If you remember, until the 6th of October, we thought that the month of October would be crucial in the history of Israel because of a struggle between the judicial system and the political system. We have forgotten about it but we were witnessing weekly demonstrations of almost 500,000 secular Israeli Jews fighting against a government that is led by the settlers and wanting to turn Israel not only into an apartheid state, which it already is, but also into a theocratic, messianic, fundamentalist, theocratic state. And against that, they fought. This was almost an internal Jewish thing because the occupation was not mentioned, the Palestinian issue was not part of it. It was like a fight between one version of apartheid Israel which is more secular and more westernized, against a more traditional, theocratic, Iran-like version of Israeli apartheid. But this is not going out of the window because of the war. I mean, the war created this false unity in Israeli society as if, okay, we don't have these problems anymore. You already can see it's coming back, and it will come back. Why do I mention it? Because I think this was a very important process that shows you that the Israeli Jewish society is imploding from within, regardless of the Palestinians. Even without the Palestinian dimension, the idea that you can create a state on the base, or you can redefine a religion as a nationality, is not working. You can create, and Israel created, as Azmi Bishara rightly says, it did create an ethno-national identity. But the fact that they created it did not solve the problem of the identity. And I think what happened that in the settlements, a very difficult version of ethno-national identity has developed. This will weaken the Israeli society from within. In fact, it is a danger for them that it can disintegrate. That's why you hear, and I understand why, all these mu'amarat, all these conspiracy, because it came in such a convenient moment to Benjamin Netanyahu, and then you start asking yourself, is the Israeli army that useless that it took its 8 hours to get for a drive of 1 hour from, Israel is not the United States. To shift forces, you don't need 5 days, or you don't need even 5 hours. I'm not saying, I don't know, I'm not a Mu'ammara person, I'm not a conspiracy person, but you understand where it comes from, because it came in a moment where Israel was about to disintegrate, not militarily or economically, but socially. There was a disintegration of the society. They lost the common solidarity, the common basis. This will return. So the day after is not just about what we talked a lot, which is the most important one, undoubtedly. What would Israel do in the Gaza Strip? What Israel would do in the West Bank? The day after is also what will happen inside Israel. The day after is also, is an unknown for us, the relationship between Israel and Hezbollah. We don't know exactly how it will develop. One can only imagine what would have happened if Hezbollah would have joined Hamas at the same moment.
Or it even still might.
Still might, but it's a different scenario when the Israeli army is, in full force on the northern border. It would have been different because most of the Israeli army was in the West Bank. We have to remember that. They sent 1,000 soldiers to the Jenin refugee camp to catch 3 people.
And a couple of brigades just to protect one sukkah. And
one sukkah, exactly. So there was a real issue there. So the day after is, on the one hand, a continued Israeli effort to change the demographic reality, I call it, of Palestine, hoping that the war will be long enough to do it under the cover of war. The more we will be in a situation that at least the region and the international community will define as the end of hostilities. As terrible as may anything unfold after that, the less Israel would be able to do drastic changes to the reality.
But on a social level, and regardless what is the outcome of the war, do you think Israelis would stop for a minute and think, what we have done, this can't go on forever?
That's why. So I said, I divided to short term and long term. So all I talked about now is the short term. In the long term, first of all, I have to hope as a human being, and also as an Israeli Jew, I would hope that the most important lesson from what happened in the morning of the 7th of October, and I understand it could not be the lesson that is being learned immediately, is the limitation of the power of force. The limitation of even the strongest army in the Middle East to force its will on millions of people and treat them in inhuman way and not letting them decide the future. You hope that in the long run, and I believe it will happen, in the long run, more Israelis than now, Israeli Jews we are talking about, more Israeli Jews than before would understand that there is a fundamental issue here which you cannot solve by tanks, by F-16s, American warships, or whatever military capacity you have. This is a long-term process. Now, by the way, part of the long-term process of this, and you can already see it, are Israelis who have the means or the European passport are leaving Israel. The numbers are very high. One of the reasons they're leaving, I think they already digested that and are afraid, which I can understand. They're afraid of living in a post-Israel Palestine, if you want. I would love to live in a post-Israel Palestine, but as you know, I'm not a very good representative of the Israeli Jewish community. By the way, there were quite good, nice people who were part of the white community in South Africa that decided to leave South Africa because they were afraid of living in a post-apartheid South Africa. That's okay. That doesn't deter us from dreaming and working for a decolonized Palestine and a free Palestine, that's for sure. But I think some of them would probably understand that there is another way. I mean, what is so interesting in the basic commentary you hear on the Israeli radio and television is that now everybody in the Israeli society is awake that there is no other way. Namely, other way for what? To occupy Gaza again, to occupy area A and B again, ethnic cleansing, and so on. You cannot hear anyone. They don't allow anyone. And I'm sure there are some who would say, no, wait a minute. There is another way. Even on the issue of the people who were taken by the Hamas to Gaza, they are giving the Israeli public this idea that the only option is a military occupation of Gaza in order to release the people, which is, again, is a false assumption. Of course, there is another way to get everyone who was taken, including, by the way, the soldiers, to get them back home. Of course, there is another way. There's always another way. But they don't want it. So I hope that in the long term, this cynical, sinister way Israel treated the kibbutzim in the south that were attacked, the people who were taken to Gaza, the Palestinians inside Israel. Maybe some people would have some compassion towards what Israel, or if not Israel, the army, at least Israel, the settlers, is doing to the Palestinians in the West Bank. You hope that there's, you and I know the Israeli Jewish society, and I was talking to a multaka yesterday in Arabic, to Palestinians from Germany mainly, who don't know the Israelis apart from being settlers and occupiers. And they asked me about the 48 Arabs. And I said, I think the 48 Arabs have a more complicated view of the Israelis because they lived with them for 75 years. And sometimes, and it happens, that on individual basis, you don't only meet the ugly face of the Jewish society. You can work with people, you can be in the same university. So I said it's a more complicated relationship from the one Palestinians in Gaza or Palestinians in the West Bank, or definitely Palestinian refugees, have with Israel. But in order to make that experience to something positive that will enable joint life together, the Israeli Jews have to see it as an asset. But what we see now is the right wing in Israel trying to identify the Arab Samani Arba'in, the 48 Arabs, with Hamas and their image of Hamas. And this comes back to a very old problem that the West is not willing to talk about. And this is racism in Israel.
Professor Ilan Pappe, from all of what you said, I must disagree on one thing.
Okay.
You said that you're not a good representative of the Jewish community. I disagree, and I'll tell you why. Because at the end of the day, I think we have the moral obligation to at least imagine a shared future. Because we should humanize both communities. These are elders, these are babies, these are normal men and women who just want to live their lives, and we're not always ideological. And we should always remember that we should think and imagine of a future without, and I'm saying this at the brinks of World War III, if this keeps on keeps on escalating. And this notion that you can't solve everything with power. Power has its own limitation, and you lose yourself to using all this power. And one of the things you've mentioned the West, and I think it is astonishing that neither from the right or the West, in Europe or in the States, no one is talking about a shared future.
Yeah.
Like both sides are criticizing the other side, which I understand their ideological perspective, but you don't hear, for example, people accepting your personal initiative with the Awad Abdel Fattah, the one-state solution, or a solution of state for all its citizens, or imagining this like a way of building a state that sees everyone as equal. And you would expect it, especially after what happened in the apartheid South Africa. And this is also a disappointment from the West, that you should humanize, and you should also work for a better future together. And I think this is the only way to move forward with less military intervention as possible.
I totally agree with you, and I think that, and I talked with our Abdel Fattah and other friends in our initiative. This is the time also to talk about the shared future. When you talk about a shared future, you don't lose your moral compass. And you can, and this, I think, what enables me, and I hope, to be quite effective in the way I appear in the Western media. And I can easily deal with, the typical Western media question. So do you condemn what the Hamas? The first question is, I want you to condemn what the Hamas did, and so on. This moral compass allows you to, as I said, distinguish between pretext and context, to understand your moral approach to events, to have them in the right moral perspective. And you're doing it because you know that you believe in a shared future. And because of that, you can demand from the Western media, for instance, to have a conversation, not the one they want, but the one that they think that they need, exactly. And I think so far I have succeeded in doing it, and I saw some of my colleagues succeed in doing it. Because one thing we shouldn't do is allow them to determine what the conversation is about. The conversation is not about Hamas as ISIS, or Hamas as Nazis, not about military tactics. The conversation is, as I put it in one of my interviews, is not about the symptoms of violence, but about the origin of violence, the source of violence. And only people who understand the source of violence are the only people who can talk about a shared future, because the symptoms of violence have affected, as you said, everyone, affected Jews and Arabs, and will continue to affect. The source of violence enables us to see the way out of it. And the way out of any source of violence is not more violence, that's for sure.
Professor Ilan Pappe, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
يعطيك العافية عزيزي.
شكرا.
هي كانت كمان حلقة من بودكاست الميدان من سلسلة الحلقات بالإنجليزي، وزي دايما ما تنسوش تتابعونا عبر جميع تطبيقات البودكاست.